Bonjour à tous et toutes. Il est 11 heures.
Hello, everyone. It's 11. We will start this webinar. I'm very happy to welcome you for the presentation of the Global Synthesis Report on Local Climate Action for 2022. I'm Antoine Gillot. I'm the coordinator for the Global Coordinator for Non-State Actors. And I'm here with my colleagues, Tanya Thomas and Samuel from the Climate Chance. They are research officers. And we will present the 2022 emission of cities and regions. We are waiting for everyone to join and we will get started. Maybe a few introductory remarks. We will all be speaking in French, but there is live translation and the presentation is in English. And there will be a time for Q&A at the end. This is also recorded. This webinar is also recorded. In order to access interpretation, you can click on the globe at the bottom and you can choose the language of your choice. I can start. So there we are, the three of us, Antoine, Tanya, and Samuel. We have worked in the last few months to write this global synthesis. This is the final edition for this year. Following last year's reports, I want to greet Samuel Laval. This is his last week. He will be leaving us on Friday to do other things. So this is his last presentation. I want to thank him for all his work, his investment in the last couple of years that he has been with us. Just to give you an update on Climate Chance, our association. This was started in 2016 with an online portal for action to facilitate access to climate-related information. And this is both in English and in French. This is something that's very important to us in order to showcase our best practices from non-state actors across the world, civil society, NGOs, etc., in their diversity. It's also a global observatory on non-state climate actions. We want to tell the story behind the figures and analyze the real impact of implemented action from non-state actors to fight climate change through some reports like this one and study cases, which you can find online. This is also the organization of federative events for the climate community to create a network to strengthen cooperation between non-state actors and contribute to the emergence. This is a favorable context. Some of you took part in our summit in early March in Nantes. I mentioned this because it was both an important moment to be able to meet physically for the first time for almost 2 years, to be able to exchange ideas, to debate, talk about the new Green Deal. This report that we are presenting today with our colleagues was actually conceived also through the debates, especially for the European aspect. So this global synthesis has a strong European flavor, if you like, and we have concentrated or focused some of our analysis on this. Climate Change is also working in partnership with some of our partners, which you can see here. And they have helped us to write this report, which I'm sure will help you to contribute, to inspire you for your actions, and to help you understand more complex analysis on climate action. Now, this Global Synthesis report on local climate action is our fourth edition. The report has changed greatly and has improved greatly over the last few years. I think this year's report can be seen also in view of last year's report, which was very detailed. With some input from many case studies. What we are also updating our work so that we are now tackling new topics, and we have to make some choices. So we have to renew our topics to give you a more thorough overview for cities and region. This year synthesis, just as the sectorial synthesis that was published for the summit, is both a complete report, but also a report that can be used sector per sector. We have various formats, various sections, if I may say, to enable you to have a particular overview and to answer questions through some case studies, initiatives in focus, networks in focus, and infographics as well. And the infographics are here to help us to look at the main data for access to climate actions. In the 2022 edition, you will find four main parts, and that's the methodology of the observatory. What we do is that we first observe figures regarding emissions. So we have emission results, and if we don't have the figures, we look at practices. That's the basis of our methodology. We start with the assessment of cities and regions, and then we look at the various levers to reach those results. So we start by looking at the world governance of the networks and the international cooperative initiatives. That's the second part of our report. And the third part is a focus on each of these networks and international cooperative initiatives with a presentation of the network, the presentation of their projects and their more recent programs, and case studies from cities or regions which are members. And there you can look at more details and see how the public policies for climate action are implemented. The last part, which is a special focus this year as part of our European Summit, we have studied at the end of our report the regional governments in the European low carbon strategies. And to look at the, in order for the just transition to be taken into account. Without further ado, let's get into more details and look at the key takeaways of this 2020 edition. So my colleagues and I will take the floor to present the 5 key takeaways that we have highlighted for this presentation. And we will very humbly look at all the various trends of our action, which we wanted to report in this edition. Let's start with the state of the global state of emission reporting on gas emission for cities and regions. First of all, I would start with this quotation from Antonio Guterres at the COP26, and he reminded us of the importance of implementing our commitments to make them concrete and to take actions to also bridge the deep and real credibility gap in order for the global subtakes, which will take place next year by the UN, according to the Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, which will be the first main assessment of all the signatories of the Paris Agreement And Antonio Guterres, who was General Secretary of the UN, to have an assessment of all the progress made by cities and regions as contributors for the collective effort in order to reach our goals. There will be a special focus group, and we hope that this report will be able to bring light to these efforts. Now, how do we assess our efforts and the progress made by the many governments and the many cities of all the 180 signatories of the Paris Agreement? This is a huge task force for anyone who would like to tackle this by identifying all the cities and regions where there is climate action and some results to assess. The more natural choice, of course, is to turn to these international initiatives of the local governments, which serve as the frame and catalyst for climate action, and also as platforms for reporting on the gas emissions, mainly the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is, of course, one of the largest initiatives, which started in 2018. It's a merger between the European Covenant of Mayors and the International Covenant of Mayors. It gathers over 11,000 signatories, which represents about 13% of the world population, with a mitigation potential of 1.9 gigaton of CO2 every year in 2030. This is a partial initiative, of course. There is a geographical lack of balance, with some members very much present on the European continent, but this initiative helps us to have a more harmonized reading and overview of all the cities, the efforts made by all the cities and regions. We had a common reporting framework, which is the Global Climate Summit in San Francisco, which is a framework for a common reporting framework with the two main platforms, international platforms for the cities, which are the CDP ICLE, the Unified Reporting System, and the EU Covenant of Mayors, My Covenant, called My Covenant. Now, if we look at these two platforms, starting with the CDP ICLE Unified Reporting System, in 2021, there was a slight decrease of cities reporting compared to 2020 for different reasons. We can mention, of course, the pandemic, which made it more difficult to monitor all the efforts, yet there is an increase or rise of the results, mitigation results, which is a very positive point. What have been the drivers of mitigation identified by the cities for those that reported their results? First of all, a technological change for about a quarter of them, change of behavior, a change of policies, but also, and that's another important fact, a change in accounting methodology and data access. So this is like 6 years after the signature of the Paris Agreement, even though we have been monitoring cities for much longer than that. So this is still a new method of reporting, which requires a lot of technological know-how, a lot of political willingness, and financial means. There are still some changes to be happened. So a lot of the cities have been using the same methodologies, which is a GPC, which means that the other half of the people use various types of methodologies, which does not allow us to have yet an aggregated overview of all the cities with different sizes. There is a tendency to have a more regular monitoring, sometimes an annual reporting from larger cities, which have more means to do so. On the other hand, we have more irregular reporting from smaller cities. So we want to have a more realistic reading of the data, and yet we are not in a position to report an aggregated results, but we do have a more regular monitoring. Now, regarding the European Covenant of Mayors, the main report is with the European Center for Reporting, which reports almost every 2 years, which means that the study which we had in 2022 is actually related to data from 2020. It requires sometimes to update the data. Now, what we can see among the 1,643 cities which are committed to the Covenant of Mayors, which have prevented at least one monitoring emission inventory, an MEI, they have published at least one inventory to assess the evolution. So out of these cities, we have seen a decrease of 19% on average of emission reduction from the baseline emission inventory, the BEI, which means that cities involved in the Covenant of Mayors more or less are aligned to the target for the reduction of gas emission by 20%, or pretty much overall. What we see that 40% have already overshot their 2020 target, and 82% of them are very close to the 2020 target. There is a commitment, therefore, to have a monitoring and an assessment of the inventories, which helps us see what the improvements have been. We can also look through these studies, the main gap between the emission inventories and the decision making. The average inventory is 2 years, or actually 2014 for the latest inventories out of the 1,643 signatories, which means that 2014 compared to 2020 is the average time for a term in France, for political term. There is therefore a challenge to narrow the decision making to the inventory in order to have more relevant and more tangible and reliable data in relation to local government. So that's therefore our first key takeaway. The signatory cities of the Covenant of Mayors in Europe have mostly met their 2020 emission reduction targets. However, with the average monitoring inventory dating back to 2014, the lack of regularity in monitoring emissions creates a gap between emissions measurement. In order to make up for this, we have identified 3 pathways to strengthen the robustness of the data: the harmonization of reporting practices and methodologies, and 2 other ways or pathways, which are the real-time monitoring of emissions through a more refined use of activity data available in all sectors in order to narrow down the time. And the third point is the specialization of emissions through atmospheric measurement like satellite or ground sensors, which open up new avenues to have a more refined monitoring on a given territory. For example, the carbon monitoring cities, which is an initiative with a number of stakeholders from the Carbon Monitor Institute and other emerging stakeholders for monitoring emissions. This has enabled us to have more in real-time assessment of large cities such as Paris, Beijing, or Berlin, with more precision to the size of a city or region. We also noted that in Mexico City, there has been a project in partnership with local universities with ground sensors to be able to capture gas emissions within urban boundaries. Also in Paris, we have the Meteo Carbon projects in partnership with Origin Earth as we can see, there is a whole new movement within the academic and university domain to see new tools emerge in order to capture these emissions and to have a more precise data. We are not able to include scope 3 like data related to exploitation or consumption. These tools are additional to other tools and are still in a pilot scheme. That's our second key takeaway, therefore, that's still in the pilot phase. Advances in emission measurements using satellite data and ground sensors are renewing carbon accounting. They're opening up new perspective for more real-time monitoring and finer specializations of emissions, which can precisely guide public action. Thank you for your attention for this first part. I'm now going to give the floor to my colleague, Tanya Thomas. She will present all the other takeaways regarding the work that we have done in partnerships with all our actors. Tanya, the floor is yours. I'm now going to talk about the third key takeaway, the overview of international networks and cooperative initiatives for climate action for local and regional governments, with the implementation of the various tools for strengthening capacities and supporting territories in their transition. This is the second and the third part of the report, which I'm going to present now. The specificity of the third part of the report is that it was written with 12 different networks and a collaborative effort. As you can see here, we had a steering committee with also our local team, and we have therefore established 14 focus points taken from various initiatives or very supportive initiatives through a general presentation of the structure with a number of members, the new additions and the date of creation and so on. Then we asked each of these structures to send us some updates and update on the latest programs and projects. And also, we also have some inputs on these networks, and we have some practical examples of efforts and exemplary actions. Before moving on to the next slide, we want to thank all those who have contributed in this collaborative effort, and many of you are here today with us. Moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about a theoretical framework that will help us to institute what we have been doing in the last few years. First of all, we have noticed a proliferation of the LRG networks and cooperative initiatives. You will see the difference between this in our report. These networks and initiatives are a natural reaction to two processes. On the one hand, we have an importance of the local actors on the international scene, in contrast with the lacks of the existing governance, the ecosystems with so many networks and local governments, and we want to give them a space to make their voices heard and to be able to collaborate. And this is how we have seen this transnational governance emerging. It's both challenges and opportunities. Challenges in the sense that we have to make sure that there is no duplication or overlapping of efforts. And I will come back to this later on. This part of our assessment of our thesis is also looking at the way that the main actors and networks have gathered and have managed through time to give way to initiatives which have gathered in order to create the National Covenant of Mayors, which gathers a large part of the population, as Antoine said. And you will see more details on this on our report. Moving on to the next slide, the joining forces through networks and initiatives, which is a sort of a meta-analysis that we carried out after compiling all our data. What we see here is that the governments take profit from being members of various initiatives and networks through main categories. First of all, we have the capacity building aspects of programs such as twinning programs and export missions of the European decarbonized and the various networks or events which have just been mentioned. And these events enable for exchanges. Also, we have been carrying out training for local governments. Secondly, we have access to finance. These are funds and mechanisms such as the European cities facilities or transformative action program, the gap funding, etc. All of these programs or tutor fund for the from the Under 2 coalition, and this is to help the local government and regional governments to finance their initiatives. Finally, the third point is the elaboration and implementation of climate plans. These are programs to help the local and regional territories and governments to help implement their action plan. Like Climate Energy Cities and other Climate Alliance and so on. So these organizations offer local governments more power at the international level, such as the advocacy for the CGU at the UN or the Region's Voice program, etc., which highlight the local action, climate action through the means of the utilities platform. Now, when we look at case studies, through practical examples, what we can see here are the efforts and the progress that have been made through these various case studies. What we realized that despite a frailty of finances due to the pandemic, territories have still continued their climate action with a change of methodology, which Samuel, my colleague, will explain to you. What we see here are the various strategies that have been used, like the greening method for urban green spaces or policies for forests. The Climate Pathway project of the Under 2 coalition, the sectors of energy and low carbon electricity are also areas where a lot of local governments have more autonomy now to carry out actions to either make the transition to low carbon electricity. So we also notice an increase of the participatory climate planning thanks to various tools to include more citizen participation, like the participatory budgeting. We also have the case study in Lebanon, which shows how climate actors or climate actions can be a tool for access to finance. This is the case of Danya in Lebanon for both mitigation and adaptation in order to have a more holistic approach of climate finance and planification. As we can see in Cape Town or Athens in Greece. I will now give the floor to my colleague Samuel, who will present more in detail the strategies and the way that local and regional governments have carried out their action with a focus on European cities. Thank you, Tanya. Indeed, I will conclude this presentation of our main key takeaways of the global synthesis on climate action. And in about 10 minutes, we can have a time for Q&A and answer your questions. If you have any, please do not hesitate to post your questions via the chat via the module. So indeed, we started this last part of the synthesis through a global overview. As Tanya was saying, what we can observe is that a proportion of these governments have developed mitigation and resilience actions. On the next slide, what we can see, of course, is that because of the COVID pandemic, there was a great impact on finances for local action. In Europe, for example, 125 billion euros more have been spent for dealing with the pandemic, and 55 billion less income because the public transport, for example, were less used during that period, of course. Now, because of this shock and the urgent climate crisis, so we don't know whether this is a conscious or not conscious move, but what we have noticed is that more and more actions have combined both a resilient development of the resilience and a mitigation of the gas emission. The great example in Europe, of course, is the cycle path in European cities, the European Cyclists Federation, which added about 1,500 additional kilometers in European cities between 20 and 21, which is a double figure to what was previously announced. Another example of such actions, we talked about this in our report in November, the PPA, the emergence of the PPA, mostly in Europe, but also in the US, in Australia. So these are long-term contracts in order to supply renewable energy. A city, for example, commits to buy over a period of 30 years the production from a wind plant or from a solar plant in order to generate more stable incomes on a longer period of time, and for the city to be able to secure supplies over a long period of time. A third example of similar actions, what we call nature in the city. We have many examples in our report, an example on Athens in the third part of our report, with much reflection on green spaces in order to avoid a heat silos in the cities or heat hubs. Bringing nature into the city is also bringing capacities to absorb emissions. As we were saying in this last part, we have focused mainly on the role of European regions. Why European regions? This is our next slide. Because of COVID, the EU implemented a huge recovery plan. The funds were conditioned, or the attribution of these funds were conditioned to the national recovery plan implementation. 37 of the national recovery plans had to be devoted to climate action. That was the condition, which of course with which of course helped speed up climate action. Now, the European Green Deal, which was launched in late 2019 in order to make the European continent a carbon neutral continent. The Fit for 55 package, which was launched in 2021 in order to reach the minus 55% target of the Green Deal in Europe by 2030. This was of course another lever for climate action, which is why we wanted to focus on Europe. That's why we had this summit in Nantes. Now, why the regions? In 2020, we had the new multi-annual financial framework that was launched in order to set the main axis for the policies for the accessing the various funds from the EU for 21 to 27, sorry, for the period 2021 to 2027. And 30% of this cohesion policy should be used. This cohesion policy is mainly a regional policy in order to reduce inequalities between regions, to help regions to develop and to help regions to trigger the low carbon initiative, which is why we wanted to have a focus more on European regions. Now, what we can see is that historically speaking, European regions are given a role mainly on adaptation policies. Why? First of all, through their skills and competencies, they have competencies which are good for adaptation actions. As you can see to the right, this is a chart. When there's a green box, this shows that the competence of a country has been identified, has been part of the region in this country. This is a report of the CCR published in January. And this report is based on various contributions from NGOs and associations. There are a few gaps. The green box means that the competence is present, and the white one does not necessarily mean that the competence is not yet present, but not identified. Yet this shows that regions do have key competencies for climate action. We can move on to the next slide, just to look at the second region, the territorial approach. So we had three main reasons: the jurisdiction, the territorial approach, the positioning of the region. The difference between the national, regional, and local levels means that regions are the first actors to have to approach this policy. Usually they implement what has been decided at the national level. The regions are the regions that apply the national low carbon strategy in their territories, what we call the STRADET. In Germany, it's with the federal states. In Spain and Britain, Great Britain, this is a bit different, as you can see. So they have to take into account the various issues of the specific region, which needs to be adapted to the regional action case by case with the local actors, etc. And at the local level has some obligations toward the region and the nation. For example, in France or in Germany, only, for example, in Germany, the lenders have authority over local government's actions. So we do have this territorial approach in the regions. And the third reason, probably the most important one, is that the place of the regions in adaptation policies, which is increasingly important for at least three main reasons. The regions are generally generally cover relatively uniform geographical areas. For example, in France, you have a different climate between the north of France or the south of France, which means that the adaptation policies are not exactly the same. So what we have seen for the last few years in Germany, in France, for example, in Italy, in some of the countries in Eastern Europe, is the emergence of local observatories which try to anticipate the climate changes and climate hazards in their regions. These are some kinds of interfaces between science and policies in order to advise policy makers or decision makers. I have to move on, sorry. Okay, so European regions have been identified as playing a key role in adaptation. What we can see in the results for 2021 in the CDP, we see that they also have a role to play in the mitigation. 28 European regions reported their emissions to the CDP in 2021, as we can see here, and 15 of them have reported a decrease of their emission that we can see here in green on the map. And among these ones, among these five have declared that this was due to the renewables in electricity production. This is how they managed to reduce their emissions. Austria, Lower Austria, Veneto, Andalusia, Scotland, So these are the 5 regions which explain the decrease of their emissions. Which leads us to the second great key takeaway. The European regions that are strongly committed to renewable energy have seen their emissions falling in recent years. In addition, action from European regions to adapt to climate change has become more structured with the appearance of numerous regional energy climate observatories and the support of European funding. So now the new Green Deal, to give a new impulse to climate action, as I said, 30% of the European structural and investment funds aim to support the regions will have to be devoted to climate action over the period of 2021 to 2027, which may give way to new climate finances for the regions. Then we have the adaptation mission, which is part of the Horizon Europe Fund, which aims at helping 150 regions to become climate resilient. And what we see that the adaptation is more with the regions and mitigation with the cities. There is a different fund to make 150s carbon neutral by 2030. These are new funds for resilience and adaptation. And the just transition mechanism, which is going to focus on the regions and release some specific funds to help the regions to reduce gas emissions. As a conclusion, we need to mention that there is a difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Generally speaking, Western regions, and due to the history and the identity of the regions in the East, when regions exist, have been mostly created when joining the EU. So what we have noticed is that programs that have been submitted in the west of Europe, most of these programs are focused on the regions that have specific program. This is the circles to the left, whereas in the east of Europe, these are more national programs, which you can see to the right of our chart. The difference can be found also in the actual management of the structural funds or funds, European funds management. In the east of Europe, it's either, or in the west rather, it's either for the regions or split between regions and the national governments, whereas in the east of Europe, it's mainly through the national government, which leads me to the last key takeaway of this global synthesis report on local climate action, that the role of regions in mitigation policies is increasing with the European Green Deal. 30% of the European structural and investment funds will have to be focused on climate, and mainly in the region for Western European countries. And the just transition mechanism gives regions a greater legitimacy to drive territorial transformation that benefits the climate, the economic, and the local social fabric. We're coming now to the end of our presentation. We have about 15 minutes left to take some questions. I can see some hands. Okay, no Q&A in the Q&A module. You can still post questions there. No, I can't see who raised their hands. Patrice, you have the floor. Patrice, you can unmute and you can speak now. Okay, well, let's move on then. Next person. Ablai Farm. You raised your hand. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Congratulations, first of all, for this presentation. I'm Dr. Ablai Fame. I'm working with an NGO based in Senegal. It's an international NGO. For some time now, we started working on the issues of adaptation and mitigation for climate change here in Senegal and in Africa in order to meet this emergency. As you know, Senegal is a coastal country with over 700 kilometers of coastline. We are among countries that are the most threatened by climate change. So my question today is focused, even though your presentation was mostly focused for Europe, but what answers, what solutions for African countries, coastal countries, in order to find sustainable solutions? Second question, how to integrate these networks in order to share experiences, share best practices, so that we can also experience these things in our own regions and territories. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Other questions? Maybe we can take several questions in. Yeah, when you first raised your question, I wanted to answer your second question. What we put forward in this report is all the actions of the various networks committed to climate action, with a strong presence of these networks in Africa. For example, the COMSSA, the Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa, Climat Med, which is the equivalent of the equivalent in the Mediterranean region. So these networks, and we have given many examples in the third part of our report. So these networks have either helped to access finance, to access technical expertise for cities in Africa. I can't remember exactly which specific studies we had for a coastal case study. I don't know if that answered your question. Yes, for some years now at Climate Chance, we have valued transnational cooperation through network, through initiatives, in order to put structure to local climate action, to have a more dynamic. The Covenant of Mayors in Sub-Saharan Africa has been very dynamic since the last 5-6 years to work with cities in order to access more sustainable energy. We also have various regional sections of other networks which are very active in the Covenant of Mayors, which are also bringing support through their programs and through their projects either to bring technical support or to develop networks. And also Climate Chance has been organizing for the last 4 years some specific summit in Africa. We will be meeting again in October in Dakar if the health situation allows. And we will have a Climate Change Summit, which will be a place for meeting, for working, for networking, for doing workshops in order to have common projects with local stakeholders. Climate Change will be in Dakar in October. Another important thing is decentralized cooperation with African cities and European cities in order to find similarities. There are no solutions for all that are uniforms, but there are similarities still between European and African cities in tackling various issues due to climate actions. I'm thinking of Saint Louis in Senegal, for example, very much involved with Lille, two cities which have similar issues to deal with. So these are some examples. In local context. Also to add, I mentioned the COM-SSA. This is very involved in the African continent for climate action. Okay, I think you're raising your hand, so you can take the floor. Florence, thank you. Thank you, you're so good. Indeed, I'm working on sustainable food systems. We talked about this in Glasgow. We are really fighting for this. Gas emission is okay, but emissions is only part of the problem regarding environmental issues and climate change issues. What's also important is that there are cities networks. Cities are very much on demand to take part in some networks. And cities are asked a lot, and the approaches have to be participatory, multidisciplinary, etc. So it's like changing labels. But I think what's important is actually to help cities and regions to make sure there is a synergy of all their efforts to avoid any types of confusion and to avoid losing resources and capacities. Thank you very much for that input. yes, to come back to what you were saying, this vertical integration is important. We want to have synergies between local, regional, and national levels and the various stakeholders. It's important to have this collaboration, to share information. In Mauritania, for example, in Nouakchott, we saw a program to identify all the risks through a participatory program with the citizens. And we were able to have something quite specific regarding the local challenges. And it is not always possible to have that specificity from local stakeholders. What we've seen at the observatory, yes, we have focused on the countries of the G20 because of the availability of the information, but it's very important and very interesting in the future to see how public policies are worked together and are articulated in African countries and African regions, to see what are the means that are available. The Global Observatory at Climate Change is working at the development of an African observatory for climate action, and you will hear more about this probably around July. What we want to do is to really have a systematic observation logic to avoid any overlap. You mentioned also the food systems. I want to mention something. Carbon is not everything, as you said rightly. It's one of the aspects. In the past, we had a case studies as part of our Global Report 2021 regarding some food systems in Senegal. So we can have a cross view of the various issues in relation to food systems. Thanks for reminding us about this. There's another section. This is the end of part 4. And to see how the regions would get hold of the SDGs to implement the climate policies and public policies. The SDGs, when they are used, make a more integrated approach possible to have a larger overview and the interactions between CO2, food systems, resources, etc. So our entry point at Climate Chance we agree that the action can be much more efficient when it's fully integrated and connected to other issues. One last question, if you would like to react to what has been said. If you would like to maybe share some experience. Again, we will share our email addresses if you want to contact us. Okay. Thank you. We want to thank our interpreter. She has to leave in a minute. Okay. So you can find all the information on our website. You will also find a mapping that will help you show all the various actions, climate actions in the world. Many projects to come in the coming months. A study on carbon compensation, another one on textile and climate, and the preparation of new case studies on climate action in some countries, and the sector-based climate action and we will have, as I mentioned, our event in Dakar in October. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you for taking part. Do not hesitate to take part. So see you soon, and thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.